we've got some big household names in our sites today. But looking at whether they're doing.
I think you're pressing buttons before I'm getting a chance, Christine.
I'm on it. I'm on it.
One step ahead of me there.
Right.
Okay. Hi everyone, and welcome to Lanarkshire Family History Society's webinar for August. My name is Claire Wilson and I will be your host for this evening. My co-host tonight is Christine Woodcock. How are we tonight, Christine?
We're very good today.
Good. And how is the weather in Canada?
Blistering hot. We're under a heat dome. So it's for the last couple of days we've been under a heat advisory. It's in the 40s.
Oh, we've actually gone back to being, as they say in Scotland, dreich.
Yeah. Well, it's 40s not bad, except that where we are, where I'm about an hour to 90 minutes from 3 of the Great Lakes. So we get all that moisture as well, which makes it untenable.
Yeah. Yeah.
However, I'd rather have this than have all of the winter stuff. So I'm not complaining.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. As always, everybody, we are streaming live to YouTube tonight. So if you would prefer not to be seen on camera, then please turn your camera off. We'd also be obliged if you would mute yourself unless speaking, as this ensures that everyone can hear the presentation with the least amount of background noise. And as Zoom is becoming ever more popular these days, if you can turn off your camera during the presentation, it does hopefully improve the bandwidth and stop delays or any screens freezing. A few news items before I hand over to tonight's speaker. If you're new to Genealogy, you may remember that last month I mentioned my new series, Bringing Your Ancestors to Life. Episode 1 is actually going to air on YouTube next week, so subscribe now and don't miss an episode. It's a way for anyone who's new to family history to, I suppose, add a bit more to their family tree. It's got to be a lot more than names, dates and places. It doesn't tell us much about who our ancestors actually were. So yeah, come along, get some hints, some tips. And I'm not sure how many episodes there's going to be yet. I keep adding to it all the time. The other thing is, as you know, I've got a particular passion for Air Force research. I've now created a dedicated website to Air Force research. It covers all time periods, services, country of origin and trades. It's going to be a place to publish all the projects that I work on, provide useful guides, and it'll also have a blog. So if you have an ancestor who's served with the Air Force, check out the Allied Air Force Research website, and you can subscribe for free. I'll pop some information, including the link for both of these, into the chat box. The other thing that's coming up is Scottish Indexes Conference will take place on Saturday the 4th of September. I know it's a bit away, but it is before the next meeting, so I thought it worth mentioning at the moment.
I can't believe we're talking about September already.
I know. I know. My husband thinks it's winter at the moment, actually. he's always ahead. So our speaker tonight is Linda Muir. Linda is the Audience Development Officer for the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Museum in Stirling. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Museum contains over 225 years of history. The Argylls touched many lives across the central belt of Scotland, and their impact has been felt in the small communities from which men of the regiment were drawn. In this talk, Linda will take you behind the scenes of the recently completed redevelopment project, which has seen a £4 million transformation that brings the soldier to the heart of the Argyll story. It unearths highlights from the museum's collection. She's also going to share some hints and tips on carrying out your own military research. Good evening, Linda, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi there.
Really excited to hear about this. I don't know if I've certainly visited, and I can't wait to get back to see what's been going on. I'd just like to say to everybody, if you want to pop a note in the chat box, tell us where you're calling in from today. If you have links to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, tell us a bit more about them. If you have any questions for Linda, you can also place them in there. If your question is a bit more complex and you wish to speak to Linda directly, just pop a note in the chat box. You have a question, and we come to these at the end. I know some of you, it might not be family history, it could be local history projects. Tell us about the projects, tell us a bit about where your connections are, what your interests are, and we'll go through them as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Linda.
Great, thank you very much. So hi everyone, as Claire said, my name is Linda and I'm the Audience Development Officer at the Argylls Museum. I'm just going to quickly try and share my screen there so you can see, hopefully you can all see my presentation there.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to talk you through to begin with, I'm going to start by talking you through who the Argylls are and move on to the redevelopment project that we've been working on for the past about 3 years now. And then I'm going to finish with a bit about how to look up your own military ancestors as well. So for those of you that don't know, why is this not working? There we go. So for those of you that maybe haven't heard of the Argylls before, they are one of the proudest and oldest Highland regiments in Scotland. They were originally made out of 2 separate regiments, the 91st Argyllshire Highlanders and the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, who were amalgamated in 1881 into the Argyll Sutherland Highlanders. And they were, so they started out as 2 separate regiments from the central belt, but also from quite west, through the west of Scotland and a little bit up Sutherland area. So it's quite a big regimental recruiting area that the Argylls encompass. Now, one of the reasons that we're based at Stirling Castle is because the 91st Argyllshire Highlanders, who were raised in 1794, were actually raised in Stirling Castle. So for those of you that don't know, our museum is actually based in Stirling Castle, and it's what we consider the spiritual home of the Argylls. If you see on this page, you can see we've got quite a close connection with the castle, and in fact it was the base of the Argylls and many other regiments as well throughout history, all through World War I and World War II. A lot of people that did national service actually passed through Stirling Castle, so there's quite a close connection with the military and the castle. So the regiment, as we know, it is. Sorry, let me just do this. Yeah, so it plays such an important part in how the castle, in the history of the castle, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, especially when we're talking about the museum being inside the castle and how and the connection towards that. So we embarked on a £4 million redevelopment project about 3 years ago, although it started quite a few years before that. It probably started about 5 or 6 years ago from the very beginning. And but we closed the doors in August 2018. The original museum, I don't know if anyone's ever been to it. If you have been to the museum before we redeveloped it, give us a shout in the comments, because it would be interesting to see if anyone can remember. This is probably, let's see if I can get this to go. This is probably what you remember. It's quite dated. You can tell just from the pictures, it's very dark. It's very wood, lots of woods and lots of dark colours, not very much light coming into the rooms. The museum itself wasn't quite fit for purpose. In order to get into the museum, you needed to go up a spiral staircase before you even went into any gallery. And that was one of the main issues in the castle, is that people wouldn't come into the museum because it was difficult. So one of the big things we wanted to do when redeveloping it was make it more accessible and also just make it more inviting to the castle visitor. Before we closed, we were getting around 25 to 30% of castle visitors in total. So not many people that were coming to Stirling Castle were actually coming into the military museum. And I think in many ways, you can see why. It looks very much like what you'd expect a military museum to look like. It's very traditional. It had a chronological story from start to finish. So you can see it started from the raising of the regiment in 1794, right through to its disbandment in 2006. when the Argylls were actually amalgamated with all the other regiments in Scotland and became the Royal Regiment of Scotland. So it's quite an extensive story that we needed to tell. And as you can see from the pictures, the museum had quite a lot of work to do to make it more relatable to its audiences. We spent a lot of time before the redevelopment actually checking who the audiences were and what they would be interested in. And overwhelmingly, the big change was that we needed to speak less about battles, less about honours, less about big, a lot of what we spoke about was things like the Thin Red Line. A lot of you might have heard the story of the Thin Red Line. It's one of the battle honours of the Argylls. It is very famous. It's the first example of the military standing in one long line and intimidating their enemy by thinking that there was lots more of them than there actually were. And there's a very, very good painting of it in the National Museum of Scotland as well. Now, the Thin Red Line is sort of the epitome of the Argylls, but for us and for most people that actually engage with the collection, it's the individual stories that make the big difference. It's all about the individuals that served within the regiment and how they contributed to making it a great Highland regiment. And that's really what we wanted to pull out. So we closed our doors, I think I mentioned already, in August 2018. The redevelopment had three main aims. It was to provide financial stability. Because it was quite dated, there wasn't much we could do with it from a financial point of view. We could rent out the rooms, we could host events there. Because of its nature, it wasn't quite as popular as it probably could be, especially given its location in Stirling Castle. We needed to improve collections care. Now, this is a very important one because our collection we looked after it as best we could, but in the cases that we had, we didn't have the proper mounts, we didn't have the proper equipment to actually make sure that the amazing objects that were in the collection were actually being cared for as well as they should be. And the last, but probably the most important thing, is to better engage with our audience. Now, our audience is by and large the Stirling Castle visitor. Stirling Castle visitor isn't necessarily a military museum enthusiast. So while a lot of military museums rely on people that really, really engage with military history, actually most of our visitors are foreign visitors, or they were before COVID. They were most of them came from China and America, whereas now at the moment that's a little bit different. But the other big visitor we had was family groups, so a lot of people with young children, and as you can see from the previous photos, it just didn't quite work. So we had a lot to do, and the plan was to be closed for about a year, and unfortunately that did turn into 3. However, I do feel like we've managed to achieve quite a lot in that time. The first thing we had to do was pack up absolutely everything. Now, this is a massive undertaking, and I very nicely went off on maternity leave right beforehand, so I managed to miss the whole thing. So all my colleagues had to painstakingly wrap every single object, every single item, every single piece of archive material, and make sure it was all very well labeled so we could find it at the other end as well. And we were very lucky to have the MOD actually provided us with a space at Forthside in Stirling, so we were given an excellent temporary location to store all the objects while the building work was ongoing. Without that, I think it would have been quite a struggle and quite an expense as well. So we managed to move everything into Forthside, and that included every object and even all the office equipment, absolutely everything, because the building itself was getting pulled back basically to brick. And there was no way we could keep anything within the structure of the building during the works. So as you can see from all the photos, there was quite a lot of work involved, a lot of heavy lifting. And the next stage was to get the builders in. Now, there was a lot of challenges, as you can imagine. So Stirling Castle is what would be referred to, you've probably heard of like the categories of, you talk about grade 1 listed. Well, Stirling Castle is an ancient monument, so it's even more, there's even more restrictions and protections put onto a building like this. The original building is, I think, or parts of it are. A lot of it was destroyed in a fire in the 1850s and had to be rebuilt. But there are elements of it that are some of the oldest in the castle. So while everything was getting pared back to bricks, anything that was found had to be checked by archaeologists and made sure that to find out if there was anything of significance. Unfortunately, we didn't find anything particularly cool. I was kind of hoping we'd come across something particularly interesting, but I think we found some, I think we might have found some shells. I'm not sure if we found anything much more exciting. At one point we thought we'd found a secret passageway for the Mary Queen of Scots, but they don't think it actually is. So it depends. And it's just one of those things. Depends. It just depends on what they uncover at the time. One of the big things that we were trying to do when doing the building work was actually to create a new entrance on the ground floor. And I think I mentioned it earlier. We had to go up a spiral staircase in order to actually enter the building before we closed. So there's a new entrance now on the ground floor, and that was one of the biggest changes. We opened up what was a storeroom and an old flat which was used by officers, actually became new galleries. So we opened up 3 new galleries on the ground floor space, as well as a new retail space. The vaulted ceilings you can see on the right there, that's one of the new gallery spaces as it is now. And at the top there, where the scaffolding is on the right, you can see where a new accessible staircase was put in. So even internally, the only staircases we had were spiral staircases, and they are a bit of an issue for anyone with mobility issues. So we put in a much more accessible staircase. Unfortunately, we weren't able to add a lift in just because of the way the building works. There just wasn't an area in which we could do it safely without impacting on the building too much. But it is more accessible than it was in the first place, and the ground floor is more accessible as well. So it's just a case of trying our best as much as we can to make it as accessible as we can, given the restrictions. Given the fact that we're on the top of a hill in a castle with lots of cobblestones, you have to accept that there are limitations with the structure of the building itself. So the other big thing was to change the layout and the flow and to make a much more natural flow to the new building. One of our big changes actually that we made quite early on was to change the interpretation of the collection from a chronological approach to a thematic approach. So that means instead of talking about the raising of the regiment, its history through Crimean War, through the Boer Wars, through World War I, World War II, Cold War, etc., through to its disbandment in 2006, we actually talk about it in a thematic way. So we talk about the links with Scotland, and we talk about links with medicine and soldiers, for example, in different galleries. So it means that when visitors come in, they don't need to follow the museum in a particular order. They can dip in and out and change rooms and see things in a bit, and they don't need to understand the whole chronological history of Scotland in order to understand what we're talking about in each gallery. And that's quite important in terms of the layout as well. So it's quite a lot of changes at this stage, and it moved quite swiftly onwards to starting to put stuff into the museum. This is when it starts to get really exciting. You can see on the right, there's our new, brand new entrance. On the far left is the new staircase. And in the middle, we're starting to get new interpretation boards, storyboards for people to read, and some new display cases and things are starting to go in. So this is all part of the fit out. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a step back at this point, because this wasn't the only thing that was going on. This is the builder's work. At this point, there's still a team in the offices. This is myself and my colleagues who are, well, my colleagues were working on the interpretation, so working on everything that was going on onto all those storyboards, things that were going into the cases, etc. So they were making sure that what we had was ready to go when all of this building work was completed. My job, however, was to make sure that our museum wasn't forgotten about while we were closed, especially, and this was even more important because we were closed for much longer than we anticipated. So I was responsible for making sure we had an outreach program that could let people remember the Argylls, remember that the museum was there, and raise the profile of the museum while we weren't there to physically show people the objects in person. So we went out and about quite a lot in Stirling, and a lot of what we relied on was hands-on experiences. So I made up some new handling boxes, and these included the Victorian soldier, World War I, World War II, a World War II home front and a on the front soldier box, as well as yeah, so sorry, the 4 boxes, that's the 4th. I'm trying to make a new one, but we haven't actually made that yet. Getting ahead of myself. So we took those to school groups, we took them to community groups, and we took them out and about to events like Stirling Armed Forces Day, for example, was one of the big events that we used to do as well when it was running. So it was all about giving people the opportunity to get hands-on with things, pick things up, try them on, see what it was actually like, and get an idea of what it would be like to be a soldier at that time, and give people a real chance to engage with the collection and hopefully with the Argylls as well. These are the handling boxes that I created. So these are actually free to borrow for anyone in the regimental recruitment area, which is around the Central Belt and west of Scotland as well. So this was a really important part of the redevelopment project, and it's something that it's quite important to remember when a museum's doing a redevelopment project. It's not just about the physical building itself, it's also about how the building can engage with its communities, its local area, and how we can help to do that. So that's something that I was responsible for at the time. And we hope to continue this. Obviously with COVID, we've had to restrict this slightly, but we're hoping with restrictions easing that we will start to be able to go back into the community and share the story of the Argylls. Because the castle is on a hill at the top of, with lots of cobblestones in the way, and there are staircases and things, we do need to be mindful of the fact that it's not accessible for everyone, and therefore one of the big features of the project is to make sure that we have ways of taking the museum out of the castle when it needs to. So that's something that we're quite keen to promote within the museum. And so moving swiftly kind of back to the museum itself, we managed to finally reopen our doors on the 29th of June 2021. So as you can see, the galleries are looking absolutely spectacular, and we have this wonderful museum which we can build on for the future. Her Majesty the Queen opened the museum on the 29th of June, which was quite an honour for the museum. Actually, we've got a very close connection with Her Majesty the Queen. She was given the role of Colonel in Chief on her 21st birthday, so when she was actually Princess Elizabeth rather than Her Majesty the Queen. And she's quite fondly referred to as the longest serving Argyll, because she served longer than any other soldier in the army. So the new galleries, I've spoken a little bit about the new thematic approach, but the big thing that we were hoping to achieve with the redevelopment was to focus more on soldiers and the stories and their individual stories. So we do this through, so the galleries focus on links to things like links to Scotland, stories of prisoners of war and their daring escape attempts. We've got a gallery completely dedicated to how soldiers stayed alive and how modern medicine changed throughout history, with the army at the forefront of medical innovation. We also celebrate the Argyll sense of humour and their fun side through our Spirit of the Argylls gallery, which has things like the wooden spoon that was the booby prize for a soldier when he was in a running race. There's, we've got an elephant foot that also doubles as a post box, and a lot of kind of things that you wouldn't expect to necessarily see as well, that I think visitors really respond to. And then we also do focus on how fearless the Argylls were in battle, but within that we speak very specifically about the individual stories of those soldiers, how they excelled beyond expectations, how they actually achieved great things within their role with the Argylls. And then the last gallery looks at the links to the Royal Regiment of Scotland and what we call a golden thread that exists throughout from the raising of the 91st Argyllshire Highlanders in 1794 all the way through to today, where there is a company called Balaclava Company who are linked to the Argylls within the Royal Regiment of Scotland. So it's saying that the Argylls are still existing within the current regimental structure, but also celebrating all the history that comes with the Argylls from the, it's over 225 years worth of history. So since we've reopened, we've successfully had over 17,000 visitors pass through our doors. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that's been restricted. I think it could have easily been double that if we didn't have all the restrictions in place. But I still think 17,000 people through the door within less than 2 months is something pretty exciting. And yes, we're extremely excited to open our doors and let people see. Now, I've got a little video to show you just to give you an idea of what the galleries are like. Hopefully this works okay, and just gives you an idea of what to expect when you come.
Over the last 2.5 years, the Argyll Sutherland Highlanders Museum has undergone a major transformation, and we've opened up on the ground floor 3 new galleries and a new retail space.
It's very much a new experience. There is something for everybody here.
Uniquely among Scottish military museums, we've adopted a thematic approach, which really draws out the social history of the regiment.
It's really about the human stories, about bringing the regiment alive through the stories and voices themselves. Shared with the First Battalion, Argyll, and Sutherland Highlanders. This museum, what was the home of the Argylls, is still the spiritual home of the Argylls. To this day, the museum is part of me.
We've been looking at ways to interpret the Argyll story, so bringing out these themes of community and family, a new focus on the role of women in the regiment, the impact that military medicine has had both on soldiers and has contributed to civilian medicine.
What was important to us was to see that the name of the Argylls would perpetuate the future generations. The old history of that unforgiving regiment disappeared. We must keep that to the forefront.
So I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the things that are in the museum that are, I think, the most exciting, I guess. You could say the most interesting. This is probably one of my absolute favourite objects. It's actually partly an archive material. It's one of the things I haven't really mentioned. The reason that we're able to bring out the stories of the soldiers and the objects so well is because we have this absolutely incredible archive of personal stories, personal accounts, and papers, letters, and that sort of thing within our archive. And one of the things is this letter that was sent by Private George Martin to his sweetheart Bertie. And Bertie, he talks about, we have not said about being engaged, we are practically, I hope this war will finish, for I want to get home. So he sends this lovely, it's about 5 or 6 pages, a lovely letter saying how much he misses Bertie and how much he wants to see her. Sadly, he was killed about a month after this letter was sent. And on the back of it, you can see at the very far right, there's some writing in what looks like a bit ballpoint pen at the bottom. That was actually written by Gertie quite a number of years later. And she talks about how much she misses him and how she wishes that he could have met her daughter. And it's an incredibly moving letter, especially with the response that comes from Gertie. And alongside it, we have a sweetheart brooch. Sweetheart brooches are, you can see it's the little kilt that's beside the letter on the display. And sweetheart brooches were often given as gifts to show someone that you loved them. They were sold locally to help pay for the war effort, and were often given as tokens to loved ones. it's an incredibly sad story, and it always really touches me. It's a beautiful, you can tell that he spent a lot of time making a beautiful letter to send home, with added ribbon and things like that. So it's these little stories that really come to the forefront, and we're really talking about the people back home, and how they dealt with the wars, and that's one of the most interesting things about the displays. I find that we can bring them out with these touching responses, such as the letter. This is probably one of our most famous objects in the collection, and it's Surgeon Munro's toolkit. Surgeon Munro served with both the 91st Argyll Highlanders and the 93rd Highlanders, and he cared for soldiers throughout the Victorian era wars, so during South Africa, Crimea and India. He was involved in 15 battles and saved countless lives of men in his charge, and he never sustained any injuries himself. So in our gallery, which is called Staying Alive, there is a lot of information about the stories about the people that Surgeon Munro helped. So one of them is called Captain John Muir, who was struck by a cannonball, and it took off quite a significant part of one of his limbs. Surgeon Munro amputated, I think it might have been his arm. Yes, it was. Surgeon Munro amputated his arm and saved his life as a result, and it was done on the field. At that time, it was quite innovative doing that sort of medical treatment on the field. In a lot of cases, these soldiers would have died from quite horrific injuries, but Surgeon Munro was quite an amazing figure in the Argylls over the years, and saved quite a lot of lives. It's interesting to see how things change from his era, where he was cutting off limbs without any real medical help, through to the modern day medicine that exists, and a lot of it was innovated by the army. Things like plasma, giving plasma to people with trauma injuries was one thing that was innovated in the army, and it's quite interesting to see how that's changed over the years. And certainly you wouldn't want to be injured during the Victorian period. It would have been quite grim. The last object I'm going to just touch on is the communion chalice and salver. This object, I always find it quite amazing. It doesn't seem, you often think of regimental museums and silver being quite closely linked. We do have a very extensive silver collection, but this is particularly special. It was actually purchased by the men of the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders in South Africa in 1813. And the Kirk of the 93rd is actually the oldest church session in the British Army. These objects were used all the way from 1813 to 2006. It was still in use in 2006 when the regiment was disbanded and the objects came into the museum. The reason this is quite an amazing object is because during the fall of Singapore in 1942, the men of the 2nd Battalion were taken prisoner by the Japanese, and they managed to retrieve the chalice and hide it. And a man called Major Eric Moss spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp hiding this and keeping it concealed so that captors didn't take it, because obviously a piece of silver like that would have been quite valuable. And he managed to keep it hidden and keep it within the regiment until modern day, which is really quite incredible. So those are a few things that you can see if you come up to the castle now that we're back and reopen. The last thing I'm going to touch on, before I finish up chatting, is I mentioned military family research. Now, there's quite a few different ways to approach it, and I always say when someone is looking into anything with their family, is to start with your family. It almost seems like the obvious thing, but find out exactly how much you know before you even start approaching other areas, because even just asking everyone in your family, it's amazing how much a little bit of memory can jog, a little bit of discussion can jog some memory, and just little things like you can find out dates of birth. Not even just that, you can find out bits of information about where they might have been, that can help you on your quest to find things. And I'd always suggest starting by writing absolutely everything down so you know exactly what you've got before you start. because as soon as you started, there's a lot of things that you need to know in order to find out more information. And I always say that the more information you have, the more information you can find. And that's what makes military research quite tricky sometimes. If you've got absolutely nothing, there's not a lot you can do, especially if you've got a common name. Like, for example, my name's Muir. There's a lot of Muirs in the army. And so if I was trying to find someone, it would actually be quite tricky unless I knew a lot more information. Now, I've put a few resources up on the screen there. I always say, if you do know that someone served in the army, especially if it's after before 1920, you can get a copy of their military service records by the MOD, and that's often the best place to start. It is worth mentioning that a lot of things were destroyed during Blitz, so World War II and World War I records especially can be a little bit sparse as a result. But it's always worth starting it's always a good starting point, because that's sometimes the best place to get an idea of where they served and what regiments they served in, if you don't already know that. If they died while they were in service, the Commonwealth Graves Commission is the best place to get basic information, and they usually involve place of death, date of death. They also can include what regiments they served in, and can actually include links to some records from them as well. So it's a good place to go. And then there's the usual spots like the Ancestry and Forces War records that can be really good. The other thing to do is, if you know which regiment they served with, talk to the local regimental museum. For example, we have an extensive archive of artifacts, and if you, well, I would say you can submit we normally have a facility to submit a research inquiry. It is closed at the moment, but just because of the redevelopment, we're hoping to reopen that in the next month or two, so it won't be too long until you can actually do that. And I know, for example, most other regimental museums like Black Watch, the Gordon Highlanders, the Highlanders, they all have the ability to submit a research request. Most of us have archives with personal information, personal records, war diaries, that sort of thing, and they can be a really good place to go if you're looking for a bit more information. And we're always happy to help as well. We always like a bit of a mission to try and find someone. Sometimes there isn't much information. It's always quite sad when that happens, but certainly if we can help, we always do. It's one of those things that can be a bit of a minefield going into military family research, and there can be a lot of different ways to go about it, but that's where I would always suggest starting. And if anyone's got any other questions about how they might be able to find things, I'd be more than happy to try and steer you in the right direction. So that concludes me chatting. I think I've spoken for long enough now. If there's any questions, then I haven't looked at the chat box yet, but if there's anything through, I'll be happy to answer it. And if anyone, I'll pass back, probably best to pass back to Claire and Christine.
Hello.
That was amazing, Linda. Thank you so much.
That was. Are you seeing me? Yeah? No?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Linda, if you're able to stop your screen share, that would be good.
Yes, sorry, let me.
That's all right. Just while Linda gets her breath back, remember, if you have any questions or you're working on any projects, tell us about them in the chat. If you would rather ask a question in person, then just put a note in the chat and we will let you unmute to do so.
Yeah, we had talked just before about Canada having a connection to the Argyll Sutherlands. The Princess Louises are over here and have been since middle to late 1800s. So one of our bigger regiments over here.
Yes, they've taken on I mentioned originally that our Colonel-in-Chief was the Queen, but actually before the Queen, Princess Louise was the Colonel-in-Chief of the Argylls as well. And that's where the Princess Louises come from as well, from that connection.
I'm just having a look through the chat at the moment. We've got people dialing in today from England, quite a few from Canada, from your neck of the woods today, Christine. We had an issue with the subtitles on YouTube. we were unable to go in and actually amend that because it had started recording. It will be something that we will look at for the next webinar. I did see one down here that came through personally.
There's quite a bit.
Yep. So Caroline saying she had 2 great uncles who served in the Argylls in World War I. She's saying that one survived and one was killed in 1915. Doesn't say how much she's managed to find out. If you've got any queries relating to that, Caroline, stick them in the chat box for us. Diane from Missouri, hi. I have an ancestor, Terence Campbell, who served in His Majesty's Royal Highlanders during the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania in the 1750s, 1760s. Any suggestions for research?
His Majesty's Royal Highlanders, I assume that's a local regiment over there. It's not one I'm familiar with. What I would suggest is reaching out to your local library. That's always usually the first, actually I should have said that originally, your local library is usually the best place to start. They are often quite good. I don't know about over in the States or Canada, but certainly over here, they often have their own archives or access to their own records, and quite often they have things like Ancestry for free via the library as well. So you don't, it's normally a paid for service, but a lot of libraries you can actually access it, or the majority of it for free there. So it doesn't necessarily help you that much, but that would be my first protocol, would be whichever local library is around. If there is a collection for their museum, I'd suggest seeking it out and trying to reach out to that museum as well, because they might be able to help as well.
Just to add to that, with the French and Indian Wars being with the Royal Regiment, chances are that they fought on the side of the Crown, and so would be given land in Canada. And there are all kinds of, come up here then as a loyalist, lots of records here in Canada on the loyalists. So that's another avenue that you may want to pursue.
Sorry, I'm just laughing. We had this conversation earlier on today.
I know. Almost identical.
I know. That's really, really weird. So I had a private message. The person's had to actually leave early. What she was hoping, blah, blah, blah. Let me see. I've got so many different things here that I'm going through. Yeah, so it says my grandfather's name was Dick or Richard McGee Barr. He would have been 20. He lived till he was 55, and the word is that he died of bowel cancer as a result of his wounding. But we all know that
his wounding. I thought you said his winding. Winding.
No, winding. But we all know that stories can get, changed going along. I was the last of his grandchildren to see him alive when I was 5.
Oh.
Had to leave the viewing now. I appreciate if there can be any information which would help me do more research at the museum. So I think obviously that covers what you've just said, Linda, that you'll not be taking inquiries for a month or 2.
Yeah, so as soon as we open them, they'll be on our website. There'll be a research inquiries tab that you can click onto and submit. You just put in as much information as you've got, and you can ask us for information on your relative. What I would say is the more information you can find, the better. Sometimes these, like the person said, you'd never know whether it's a true story or not. I'd suggest maybe starting with things like Ancestry in some ways, because you can sometimes get a bit more information about birth dates and census records about where they were at certain points in time, and that can be quite helpful in pinpointing whether people are definitely where they were supposed to be, based on family rumor. But yeah, the best thing you can try and do is try and get hold of their regimental number as well. If you can get hold of that, that can open quite a lot of doors in terms of research inquiries. Without it, it can be quite difficult to make sure that you're talking about the right person. So quite a lot of the time, keep in mind, if you say you've got a John Doe, there could be 10 John Does in our database, for example, that we're looking at. And until we can be sure, that could be even within World War I, never mind throughout all the regimental history. So and that's not just for the museum, for our museum. A lot of museums have the same issue. There's a lot of McDonald's, there's a lot of McLarens, there's a lot of a lot of the same surnames going around, and the most important thing is to try and distinguish your relative in comparison to them. So it's trying to get, even if you've just got like a little letter and it says something about being in the 7th ANSH, well, that's the 7th Battalion, Argyll Sutherland Highlanders, and it might not mean that much to you, but for someone that's actually helping you look into that research, it can make quite a big difference in trying to distinguish which person it is. So yeah, as much information as you can. It sounds daft, but as much information as you can have before, and the more information you have before you start, the more information you can get. Because unfortunately, if you've just got a name and a vague, we think he died of this, it can be quite difficult to actually pinpoint who they are. So even if you're not sure if it's true, sometimes even just a few bits of information can really unlock the story of a soldier while you're trying to research them.
That's true, and I mean, I think as well, it's, not everything's going to be at the Regimental Museum,
No.
Or an archive. The actual records, the birth, marriages, the deaths, the censuses tell, a progression of potentially their career through time.
It's a big puzzle, yeah. You're never going to get the whole thing from one location.
Yeah.
You're going to need to, that's the other issue with any sort of family research. You're going to need to look in 5 or 6 different places at least. And even then you might not find something in every single location, but you could find loads in one location, a little bit in another. But what you find on Ancestry might help you find a lot within the military museum that you wouldn't have found without finding that one bit of information.
Yeah.
So it's about trying to piece it all together and going back to the sources once you find more information and revisiting different sources with the extra information that you found and building on it, so that you can get a whole picture of someone's career or someone's lifetime, in fact.
Mm-hmm. That's true, and I mean, obviously the documents, you can perhaps see that, on the census, they're perhaps serving somewhere different. They've maybe been promoted. Are they living in barracks? I've came across people obviously living in barracks at times in the census as well, which is quite exciting when you find that. So Laurie's asking, has anyone heard of the term shepherds of the lambs?
No.
I don't know what that's in reference to. Maybe you can tell us where you heard it, Laurie, and maybe make a bit more sense. Jane's saying that the new galleries look fabulous. She can't wait for the opportunity to visit and explore. My mouth's not working tonight. Brian as well saying, good to see the redevelopment museum, looks great, and also looking forward to visiting. And he's looking for Gwyn relations, perhaps one of the more unusual surnames actually.
Yeah, it's always quite helpful when someone has an unusual name. It does make life a lot easier, especially if it's an unusual spelling, although sometimes spellings can be, they're not necessarily set in stone, especially the later you go around the Victorian period, the spellings could change quite a lot. That's the other thing, actually. It's a very good point to mention, is that check different spellings of your name. Even if you're adamant that that is the spelling of your name, it could be misspelt, or a family member years and years ago could have actually spelt it differently. So it's worth, if you've got a spelling where there could be an E at the end, or there could be an extra letter, try all the different options, because you might find something that you're not expecting and could have easily been overlooked.
Yeah. Caroline's saying that she's got some letters and have looked at the war diaries from when her Uncle Stuart was killed, and he's commemorated on the Menin Gate, and she visited with her mum a few years ago.
That's a great experience to be able to do. And yeah, if you're looking for more information, certainly Commonwealth Graves, if he died in service, is a great place to get a bit of extra information. And whichever, she doesn't say which regiment he was in, but certainly you can talk to the regimental museum, or even try and get hold of the service records as well.
Mm-hmm. And then Christine, you've actually put on, for those interested in learning more about military research, there's a 2-day virtual workshop on the 23rd, 24th of November with Paul Nixon, who we actually had 3 months ago.
A couple of months ago, yeah.
Yeah, I'd actually invited him tonight, but he's obviously maybe busy. He is the army expert at Find My Past. He has a forensic understanding of regimental numbers. I was actually going to mention that, because he said that when I was on a call recently with Paul, he said that when you look at the army, knowing the regimental number can actually tell you so much about their career.
It's not something I know a great deal about, but I have heard you can get quite a lot of information, and often people, when they signed up together, you can find a group of people that signed up together through those regimental numbers, and often that can be quite interesting. It's not, I've never really looked that closely into it, so I don't know a great deal about it, but it's a really interesting topic.
He covers, I believe he covers quite a lot about that on his blog, which I think is it British Army Ancestors?
BritishArmyAncestors.co.uk.
Yep, he covers a bit about that and goes through how to actually decipher it. But I know that, you know, that's quite pivotal to understanding a lot. Laurie has said, right, because Laurie had posted earlier. All right, so this is the shepherds of the lambs. I was told that they were men who looked after helping out widowed women of war and their children.
Not a term I've ever heard before, but
no. Maybe need to look into that one actually. Maybe we're all learning something.
It may be like just for a specific regiment, you know how like they have the miners' sons and Sons of Scotland and that kind of stuff. It might just be a group for a specific regiment that assisted if any of the soldiers ended up being fallen and left women and children behind.
And then Laurie's put further down, another term I've heard is the Black Watch, but the Black Watch is then another regiment.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it's maybe something relating to them. Brian said as well, talking about the spelling variants, is that he's actually seen Gwyn spelt 7 different ways. Yeah, a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, family research is so difficult when it comes to spellings. It can make or break your research, just typing, and it can be quite tedious sometimes going through all the different variations, but it really can pay off. Yeah.
I've got a question then. So obviously you have so much, you've got so many holdings. You told the story there about, you know, the guy in the letters, and do you have people there who actually look at projects and they actually research particular people, or how do you how do you find out these stories and tell these stories?
Well, I mean, for the most part, we have a curator who knows the collection back to front. He's been with the museum for I'm going to say over 25 years. I think that's about right. And he's been through practically everything in there. But I think there's still things that come out that surprise him. For the most part, there's a few of us that spend a bit of time doing our own little projects sometimes, just through things that interest us, if it's relating to our work. And we also allow other people into the archive to do research for educational purposes or family research, that sort of thing. And sometimes they can pull up things and bring them to our attention that are of interest. Unfortunately, our archive's been kind of hidden away because of the redevelopment. We've not been able to have the same sort of access, so we've kind of missed being able to get a little bit of that. But certainly, our archive is not digitized, hardly at all. I think the sort of headlines, like the title lines of each thing, are in our collection management system. But other than that, it's a case of physically going through every piece of information and finding it. So there's probably loads of gems in there that most of us have not seen, not read. It's a huge archive. It's not huge. It's large for a military museum's archive. Certainly in comparison to like the National Archives, it's very tiny. But it does have a lot of incredible stories of individuals. A lot of people have taken the time to write down their stories and pass them into us and tell us about their time in the Argylls, and that's really quite special. And then we've got a lot of things like letters that were sent home from soldiers and things like that, which they're always incredibly moving to read through. And it's always nice when you stumble across one that you weren't expecting. The letter to Gertie from Private George Martin was one of the first things I came across in the archive when I was looking through things when I first started. And it's always stayed with me a little bit because it's such a moving one. It's so sad. It's incredibly sad that he passed away, but the fact that she went back and actually wrote to him, I find incredibly moving and just really quite incredible. Just that she was holding on to that for such a long time, and obviously even felt the need to write back at that stage was quite amazing.
Yeah.
Are you itching to get in there, Claire? Find out all those stories.
Do you know, I can't help myself because I do it all the time with Air Force. You know, I'm constantly researching Air Force losses, so you know it's obviously the same for you. So if somebody was researching a project or looking for something and came across you know, a really interesting story, would it be something that you'd be quite happy, you know, for people to get in touch and let you know about?
Definitely. We're always taking in any submissions like that. If anyone does have anything related to that, you can I put my email up at the end, but also just our generic email, museum@argylls.co.uk. We're always happy to add stories into our archive. In terms of, I think I just saw someone pop up with donations from family members question. So for our archive, we pretty much take everything in, especially even if it's, you know, we can take in digital copies of things if you don't want to part with the papers themselves. A lot of the time people want to hold on to those, but we can take digital copies and we're quite happy to hold on to those and keep them in our archive. And then they're accessible for research purposes and things like that. In terms of objects, that gets a little bit tricky because then we're getting into the storage facility situation. So we can't necessarily take absolutely everything. And we do have a whole collections policy. It's actually on our website as well, if anyone's ever interested in the details. But we do have sort of a strict code that we need to abide by when it comes to accessions for the museum. Just because we can't physically take absolutely everything. And if someone offers us a badger head sporran, we have about 50 badger head sporrans. And as much as it's a lovely badger head sporran, it probably means more to the person donating it than it does to us. And sometimes it actually makes more sense to be held by them than it does for us to have another example in the museum. So it just depends on the individual one, and that's where our curator Rod would make a decision depending on what we've already got and whether it makes sense to be in the museum.
Okay, and if someone has documents that they want to perhaps supply digitally, but they don't have the facilities to do it, is that something that, you know, they can visit Stirling Castle, and while they're visiting the castle, someone, you know, at the museum could be scanning for them? Or
yeah, I mean, I'd always say if you're going to do that, to call ahead, because there isn't always someone available to do it at the time. We're a very small team. There's actually only 6 of us in total that are. And we're open 7 days a week. Most of the year we're only closed Christmas and New Year. So we can't physically have someone necessarily available to scan and write at that point unless someone calls ahead and lets us know that you're coming so that we can make sure someone's there. But if you do that, absolutely, we'd be more than happy to scan it in and add it into our digital archive. Definitely, we're always happy to add to as much as we can because it's a resource for us and it's a resource for other people to use as well. Yeah. So the more that we add to it, the more valuable it is for everyone.
That's true, and I mean, it makes sure that your family member, you know, their story is being preserved as well.
Definitely. Yeah.
You know, yep. I noticed Bill's actually put a note in saying, does the museum hold archives relating to the Stirlingshire militia?
You know, I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't think so. That might be held more locally at maybe at Stirling Libraries and their archive. I'm not 100% sure, though. I would have to check with our curator on that one. I'm not aware of any, but I don't know it as well as he does. So if there's something in particular that he's looking for, it might be worth getting in touch and we can maybe point him in the right direction. It might be something I need to ask Rod.
Claire, did you see the comment or question about that Moira put in about her great-grandfather?
Yeah, I had scrolled down for some reason. Yeah, so Moira says her great-grandfather was in the Argylls, joined in 1896, so served in the Boer War and then was recalled for World War I. He was injured, lost a leg, taken prisoner, and she has a photograph of him in the camp.
That's incredible. That's quite a story as well. It sounds like he had quite a career.
That might be one to share with the museum, actually.
Absolutely. If you've got that photograph, we'd love to see a copy of it. Please do send it in to us. It would be really interesting to know a bit more.
Do you have contact information where they can email that?
Yeah,
put that in the chat.
Do you want to put it? If you want to put it in the chat, Linda,
yeah, I can just stick my email down there.
I know it was on. I know it was on the slide, but you know, just in case anyone misses it.
And if anyone does have any specific questions, I'm more than happy I'll just put my name in there as well. You're more than happy to get in touch with me. I might not be the best person to answer the question, but I'll definitely make sure someone does.
So still a bit of time if anyone wants to put any more questions into the chat box. Just a quick mention, next month's webinar takes place on Thursday the 9th of September at 7 o'clock. The speaker will be Dr. Stephen Mullen of Glasgow University. Stephen will provide a talk entitled The Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy. It's Scotland and the Caribbean slavery from 1775 to 1838. A link to register has actually been posted into the chat box, and it will also be announced via the e-news, social media, my channels, Christine's channels as usual. If you're not already a member of Lanarkshire Family History Society, then why not sign up now? Membership fees range between £10 and £16 a year. You can find out more via the Lanarkshire Family History Society website, and I have also detailed the member benefits along with information on how to join in the chat box. So I don't think we've got any more questions. I'd just like to thank you very much for the talk tonight. It's been amazing, Linda.
Fabulous. Fabulous, Linda.
Thanks very much. Well, hopefully you get a chance to come and visit the new museum. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, I might actually drop you a message when I'm coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. If someone's around or if I'm around, I'd be more than happy to give you a wee tour as well.
Yeah, I'll do that, and I can perhaps put something on my own page and do a little kind of
blog or something.
Yeah,
I probably should
can do a blog
mention as
post.
well, while you're in the museum, if you are coming up to visit, we have a lot of our we've got a lot of veterans that actually volunteer in the museum and guide in the museum on a regular basis, and they're the heart and soul of the museum. A couple of them were actually on the video. I should have mentioned them earlier, actually. They really are such an incredible resource for the museum. It's not just veterans, but we have a range of, I think, about 30 odd volunteers that come in and show people around the museum and talk to them, and the fact that some of them actually served in the Argylls is just a wee added bonus as well. So if
that alone is worth the reason to go. That alone is worth making the trip.
I think so, because I think, you know, if anyone has questions, who better to answer those questions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. They're such a good resource, and they can really talk so well about their time in the Argylls and also the history of the Argylls. They're so proud of their regiment. And what it's achieved over the course of its history, that they can really they can probably tell you about it better than I can.
No, I'll definitely arrange to come up, and what I'll do is I'll get some details and perhaps do a blog post on the museum. That'll be fine. Yeah, that'll be good. So if nobody has, I don't think there's been any more questions. If no one has any more questions, I think we will wrap it up. So thank you again very much, everyone, for attending, and thanks to Linda for an amazing talk. And we'll see you all next month.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.